The Indiana Fever just made the move everyone expected, but almost nobody is talking about the consequences. Kelsey Mitchell got her core designation, locking her into a one-year, $1.4 million Supermax contract. Lexi Hall received a restricted qualifying offer, meaning the Fever can match any deal she gets from another team. The Big Four are staying together: Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, and potentially Lexi Hall. On the surface, this looks like a franchise protecting its core, running it back with the backcourt duo that combined for nearly 40 points per game. But here's what nobody's talking about yet. How are they going to afford anyone else? Because this isn't just about keeping your stars. This is about what happens when you commit massive money to 3 players under a salary cap that hasn't expanded to match the new CBA's epic provisions. This is about a roster that couldn't even afford to carry 12 players at the start of last season, now required to do exactly that while paying 3 max contracts. This is about depth, flexibility, and whether star power alone can overcome the mathematical reality that's about to hit this franchise hard. The Fever are betting everything on this core, and if it doesn't work, there's no easy way out. Let's start with why this was inevitable. Caitlin Clark went on NBC's Sunday Basketball pregame show and made it crystal clear. Our first priority is to sign Kelsey Mitchell back. She was first-team All-WNBA last year. She's kind of my running mate in the backcourt. She makes it really easy for me. That wasn't a suggestion. That wasn't Clark casually mentioning a preference. That was the face of the franchise, the player driving unprecedented ratings and attendance, telling the front office exactly what needed to happen. And when you've got Caitlin Clark, the most valuable asset in the WNBA, publicly declaring that someone is the #1 priority, you don't have a choice. You lock that player down, or you risk alienating the person your entire operation depends on. The Fever front office isn't stupid. They understood the leverage Kelsey Mitchell had in these negotiations, and it wasn't just her stats. It wasn't her All-WNBA selection. It wasn't even her 20-plus points per game average. It was Caitlin Clark going on national television and backing her. That's worth more than any agent negotiation, more than any market analysis, more than any advanced metrics. When your franchise player tells you who she wants to play with, you make it happen, period. So Mitchell was always getting the core designation. The question was never if, it was what comes next. And what comes next is where this gets really complicated, because the new CBA includes an epic provision that fundamentally changes how teams can construct rosters. Aaliyah Boston is max eligible right now. Caitlin Clark becomes max eligible next season. Add in Kelsey Mitchell's Supermax, and you're looking at 3 contracts eating up somewhere between 60 and 70% of the salary cap. That's not a lot of room to work with. League average salary sits around $550,000. The Fever are probably comfortable paying Lexi Hall somewhere around $700,000, maybe $150,000 above average. But here's the problem. That restricted qualifying offer they gave her doesn't guarantee anything except the right to match whatever another team offers. So what happens if the Connecticut Sun, desperate for talent after their playoff disappointment, comes in with a $950,000 offer? What happens if one of the expansion teams, the Golden State Valkyries or the Toronto franchise, decides Lexi Hall is worth $1 million because she'd be their second scoring option instead of their fourth? The Fever have to draw a line somewhere. They have to set a cap on what they're willing to pay to keep her. And if another team crosses that line, Hall could be gone. That's the risk you take with a restricted offer. You get the chance to match, but you don't control the price. And this is where the math starts falling apart. Let's say the Fever do keep Lexi Hall at $700,000. Let's say they find a way to bring back one more rotation player on a team-friendly deal. You're still looking at a salary cap situation where spots 8 through 12 are filled with minimum salary players, draft picks on rookie contracts, and undrafted free agents willing to take whatever's available. That's not depth. That's hoping you don't get hit by injuries. That's praying nobody has an off night when it matters. That's the kind of roster construction that works in the regular season but falls apart in the playoffs when rotations shorten and the margin for error disappears. Robin Lundberg from Sports Illustrated broke down the Fever's moves and said something that should make fans nervous. He said the Fever brass believes keeping Mitchell is worth having to be more creative in constructing the rest of the roster. More creative is the polite way of saying they're going to have to make painful cuts. It means they're going to lose players that fans care about. It means the roster is going to look thin in places where it really can't afford to be. And it means they're betting that star power can overcome a lack of depth. That's a gamble, a big one. Let's talk about who's getting sacrificed in this construction. Sophie Cunningham. The fan reaction to the possibility of losing her is visceral. I feel like crying. Anything for Sophie? Now I just need to know where Sophie lands. This is the human cost of max contracts that nobody wants to talk about. Cunningham became a fan favorite not because she's putting up 15 points per game, but because she brings energy, defensive intensity, and a willingness to do the dirty work that doesn't show up in the box score. She's exactly the kind of player that makes winning plays. And she's exactly the kind of player that gets sacrificed when you're paying 3 max contracts. Because here's the reality. The Fever couldn't afford to keep 12 players on the roster at the beginning of last season. They ran with 11 for weeks. Now they're required to carry 12 under the new CBA. And they've got to do it while paying Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Kelsey Mitchell a combined total that's going to eat up the majority of their cap space. That leaves you with roughly $3 to $4 million to split among 9 roster spots. That's an average of about $330,000 to $440,000 per player. That's not enough to retain quality veterans. That's barely enough to keep promising young players who might get better offers elsewhere. So what does that roster look like? You're looking at a combination of draft picks, undrafted free agents, and maybe 1 or 2 veterans willing to take significant pay cuts to chase a championship. And here's the problem with that. The Fever aren't a destination franchise yet. Indianapolis is a great basketball city, but it's not New York or Los Angeles. You can't rely on players taking hometown discounts to live there. The New York Liberty just won a championship with a similar top-heavy roster construction, but they had an advantage the Fever don't have. Players will take less money to live in New York, to be part of that market, to play in that spotlight. Indiana doesn't have that pull. Look at the Las Vegas Aces. They won back-to-back championships in 2022 and 2023, but they had 4 legitimate stars, not 3. Aja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, Kelsey Plum, and Jackie Young. And even with that star power, they still had enough cap space to bring in quality role players like Alyssa Clark and Kaya Stokes. The Aces model worked because they hit on draft picks, developed young talent, and made smart veteran minimum signings. Can the Fever replicate that with even less cap flexibility? That's the question nobody can answer yet. And then there's the elephant in the room. The Fever made the playoffs last season for the first time in years. That's an achievement worth celebrating, but they got swept in the first round by the Connecticut Sun. It wasn't competitive. The gap between them and the true contenders was obvious. So the question becomes, does running it back with essentially the same roster, maybe even a slightly worse roster if they lose depth pieces, actually close that gap? Or are they just hoping that Caitlin Clark's development, 1 more year of chemistry, and Aaliyah Boston's continued growth is enough to bridge the difference? Because the teams at the top aren't standing still. The Aces are retooling. The Liberty just won the championship, and they're running it back with their core. The Sun are going to be motivated after their playoff exit. The Minnesota Lynx are still dangerous, with Nafisa Collier playing at an MVP level. The Fever aren't just competing against last year's versions of these teams. They're competing against improved versions. Teams that are also making moves, also getting better, also adding pieces. And when you've got 3 max contracts, you can't pivot quickly. You can't make a big splash in free agency. If an impact player becomes available, you can't trade for them without giving up one of your core pieces. You're locked into this roster construction for at least the next 2 seasons, probably longer. And here's something that's getting overlooked in all the excitement about keeping the core together. One of the reasons Kelsey Mitchell had such high scoring numbers last season is because Caitlin Clark was injured for stretches. When Clark was out, Mitchell was the primary ball handler and scorer. Her usage rate went up, her shot attempts went up, and her numbers reflected that. But when both are healthy and on the floor together, those 40 combined points per game are great, but they're also a function of opportunity. What happens when you add more offensive weapons? What happens when you actually build depth? Do Mitchell's numbers stay the same, or do they come down because the ball gets distributed more evenly? These are the kinds of questions that don't get asked in press conferences or social media announcements, but they matter, because if you're paying someone a supermax based on production that was partly a result of circumstance, you better be sure that production is sustainable when the circumstances change. And there's another factor nobody's really talking about yet. Kelsey Mitchell is on a one-year supermax. That means next off-season, we're doing this all over again. She'll be a free agent again, assuming the Fever don't core her for a third time. And there's speculation that Mitchell doesn't want to keep signing one-year deals. Reports suggest she may be looking for a multi-year contract that provides long-term security. But here's the problem with that. You can only use the core designation on a player 3 times in their career. Mitchell has already been cored before, so if the Fever core her again next season, that's twice. They'd have one more time left. And then what? Eventually, she's going to have the leverage to demand a multi-year deal. And when that happens, the Fever will have to decide if they want to commit long-term money to a player who'll be in her 30s, whose game relies heavily on athleticism and quickness. That's a risk, and it's a risk they're going to have to evaluate very carefully. Meanwhile, the rest of the league is watching this situation closely, because if the Fever's top-heavy roster construction works, if they can win a championship with 3 max players and a bunch of minimum salary depth pieces, it changes the entire blueprint for how teams build rosters under the new CBA. But if it doesn't work, if they struggle next season, if they're still a first-round playoff exit or worse, then it becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of sacrificing depth for star power. And there's no easy path to recovery if it goes wrong. You can't just blow it up and start over when you've got 3 max contracts on the books. So what should Fever fans be watching for as free agency continues? First, what happens with Lexi Hall? Does another team make a serious run at her with an offer the Fever can't or won't match? Because if they lose Hall, that's a significant blow to their depth and their 3-point shooting. She's not irreplaceable, but she's also not someone you want to lose when you're already thin on the roster. Second, what do they do with Sophie Cunningham? Can they find a way to bring her back on a minimum deal, or does she get a better offer elsewhere? And third, this is crucial, who do they sign to fill out the rest of the roster? Because those depth pieces are going to determine whether this team can actually compete for a championship or whether they're just another playoff team without the horses to go all the way. The Indiana Fever are betting everything on star power. They're betting that Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Kelsey Mitchell are good enough to overcome a lack of depth. They're betting that chemistry and continuity matter more than roster balance. And maybe they're right. Maybe in today's WNBA, where the game is increasingly about shot creation and 3-point shooting, having 3 elite scorers is enough. But history suggests that depth matters. History suggests that the teams that win championships are the teams that can go 9 or 10 deep, that can withstand injuries, that can adjust when their stars have off nights. We're about to find out if the Fever can defy that history. We're about to find out if this roster construction philosophy works in the modern WNBA under a new CBA that fundamentally changed how teams can build. And if it doesn't, if they struggle next season, the pressure is going to be immense, because they'll have sacrificed depth, sacrificed flexibility, sacrificed future cap space, all to keep this core together. That's the gamble, and it's a gamble with very high stakes. The next few weeks of free agency are going to tell us a lot about whether the Fever are building a dynasty or setting themselves up for disappointment.